My cousin Nate has been in the Coast Guard for more than a decade, and if you knew him, you'd understand why I'm telling you this. He's not dramatic. He doesn't exaggerate. He's the kind of person who speaks in facts, fixes what's broken, and moves on. No ghost stories, no superstition, no what-ifs. Just boats, schedules, and doing the job the right way. That's why, when he brought this up in the summer of 2022, I didn't know what to do with it at first. I made him tell me again and again, because the story sounded unreal, but the details never changed. Not once. What happened to him started years earlier, back in 2017, when he was assigned to a maintenance rotation at a lighthouse off the coast of Maine, an outpost called Matinicus Rock. So far from shore, it barely felt real. And when I say isolated, I mean truly out there. And if you enjoy these true story-style narrations, please consider liking the video and subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. And when I say isolated, I mean truly out there. You don't drive to it. You don't hike to it. You get there by boat if the water cooperates, or by helicopter if it doesn't. It's basically a jagged slab of rock in the Atlantic, with one lighthouse and a small auxiliary building beside it. Fuel, tools, spare parts, that kind of thing. No power grid, no running water. Barely any cell service. Just wind, salt, and that constant feeling that the mainland is a different world. The lighthouse is automated now, but it still needs human hands every so often. Inspections, repairs, routine upkeep. Normally, the Coast Guard sends one person out there and that's that. In and out, quiet, boring, predictable. Except the year before Nate went, the station logged a string of electrical problems that didn't make sense on paper. So this time, they didn't send one person. They sent two, Nate and another guy named Russell. For the first few days, everything followed the routine Nate expected. The wind howled constantly around the rock, rattling the tower like it always did. But otherwise, the work was dull and predictable. During daylight hours, they ran through the usual maintenance, checking the rotation system for the beacon, testing the backup batteries, topping off the diesel generator, and scraping away the stubborn crust of salt that coated every metal surface inside the tower. By evening, there wasn't much left to do. They cooked simple meals, flipped through old paperbacks, and passed time playing cards, while the ocean pounded endlessly outside. Isolation was part of the assignment. Out there, boredom was normal. Silence was normal. At least, it was supposed to be. On the fourth night, Nate woke up abruptly sometime around 2 in the morning. There was no noise that startled him awake, no sudden movement. It was a feeling more than anything else. He described it later as the kind of tension you sense right before a thunderstorm breaks. The air thick, heavy, almost electric. Except when he listened closely, the outside world was completely still. No thunder, no rain, just the quiet ocean. He sat up in the darkness, trying to shake the strange feeling from his chest. That's when he realized something else was wrong. The light wasn't moving. Normally, even during maintenance cycles, the beacon sends its sweeping beam across the water every few seconds. It's the heartbeat of the lighthouse, steady, constant, impossible to miss. But now, the tower felt strangely dead, like the pulse had stopped. Nate swung his feet to the floor and crossed the room, waking Russell. Within seconds, both of them were climbing the narrow spiral staircase that twisted up through the center of the tower, their footsteps echoing against the metal walls. When they reached the lantern room at the top, the machinery was still running. The gears were turning exactly the way they should, but the beacon itself wasn't rotating. Something had jammed it. Wedged deep inside, the gear assembly was a chunk of dark fabric, thick, heavy, tangled in the mechanism like it had been shoved there on purpose. It looked like part of an old coat or maybe a blanket. The material was soaked through and coated in a slick, mossy grime. When Nate pulled it free, the smell hit them, immediately rotting seaweed, damp mildew, the kind of scent that clings to things that have been sitting in ocean water for a long time. Both of them just stared at it. The door to the beacon room had been locked. The windows were sealed tight against the wind. No birds could have carried something that size up there, and there was no reason for a piece of cloth like that to even exist on the island. None of it added up. Still, they didn't panic. They cleared the mechanism, tossed the soggy fabric out into the night wind, and restarted the rotation system. After a few minutes, the beam began sweeping across the water again like nothing had happened. They went back downstairs, chalking it up to some strange fluke. But the very next night, at almost the exact same hour, it stopped again, like whatever had done it was keeping schedule. Almost the exact same time. Nate woke up suddenly, his eyes snapping open in the darkness like something had pulled him out of sleep. For a second, he just lay there, listening to the quiet inside the tower. And then, he noticed it again, the same thing that had woken him the night before. The light wasn't moving. That slow, sweeping glow that should have been sliding across the walls every few seconds was gone. The tower felt wrong without it, like the lighthouse itself had stopped breathing. He didn't even hesitate this time. Nate shook Russell awake, and the two of them headed straight back up the spiral staircase, their footsteps echoing sharply against the metal steps. When they reached the beacon room, the mechanism was jammed again. But this time, the obstruction was different. Caught between the rotating gears was a smaller piece of cloth, deep red in color, thin and frayed along the edges. It looked like an old scarf or a worn shawl, the kind of fabric that didn't belong anywhere near an industrial lighthouse mechanism. And just like the first one, it was completely soaked. Water dripped from the cloth as Nate pulled it free. Tiny bits of sand clung to the threads, and even stranger, small crustaceans, little sea creatures, were stuck to the surface like it had just been dragged out of the ocean. Nate told me that was the moment the situation stopped feeling like a coincidence. One piece of debris might have been a fluke. Two pieces, on back-to-back nights, in a locked tower. That meant something else was going on. They checked everything. The beacon room door was still locked exactly where they'd left it. The windows were sealed tight against the wind. They searched the storage area, the equipment room, even the outside platform around the lantern glass. Nothing. No signs of animals. No signs of forced entry. No sign that anyone had been there at all. But something had clearly been inside that mechanism, and whatever it was, seemed to know exactly how to stop the light. From that night forward, the routine changed. Before going to sleep, they began dragging heavy supply crates into the stairwell, stacking them across the steps like a barricade. After their final inspection each evening, they locked the beacon room carefully, then secured the main entrance at the base of the tower. Every latch, every door, every lock, because by that point, both of them had the same uneasy thought creeping into their minds. If those pieces of cloth weren't getting there by accident, then something had to be putting them there. For a few nights after that, nothing happened. The barricades stayed in place. The beacon rotated normally. The tower returned to its usual rhythm of wind, metal, and distant waves. But by the seventh night, something shifted. Nate told me he was lying in bed, half awake, trying to drift off when he heard Russell speaking quietly across the room. At first, he assumed Russell was talking to him. The voice was low, almost like someone having a conversation under their breath. But the words didn't make sense. They were scattered, broken, like replies to someone Nate couldn't hear. Nate pushed himself up on one elbow and looked over. Russell was sitting upright in his bunk, facing the corner of the room. Not toward Nate, not toward the door, toward the empty corner. His lips were moving slowly, whispering short phrases into the darkness as if someone was standing there with him. Nate finally asked what he was saying. Russell stopped immediately. He turned his head with this slow, puzzled look, like someone who had just been shaken awake. And he said he hadn't said anything. For a moment, the room went completely quiet. Nate didn't argue with him. He just laid back down and tried to ignore the uneasy feeling crawling across his chest. But the night wasn't finished yet. Sometime later, Nate woke up again. This time, Russell wasn't in his bed. He was sitting by the window, perfectly still, just staring out across the dark ocean below. When Nate asked what he was doing, Russell didn't turn right away. He kept watching the rocks beneath the lighthouse before finally speaking. He said the night before, he thought he saw someone standing down there. Not clearly, just a shape, Every time the beacon light swept across the water, the figure would appear for a second in the edge of the beam, standing on the rocks and looking up at the tower. And every time the light moved away, the figure was gone. After that, things began to unravel. Russell changed. At first, it was small things. He barely slept. He stopped joining Nate for meals. Sometimes Nate would find him standing by the window long after midnight, staring out at the black water like he was waiting for something to appear again. When Nate asked if he was okay, Russell would just mutter vague answers. He started mentioning sounds inside the walls. Scratching, shifting. Once he said he thought he heard voices drifting down the stairwell when the wind died. By the 9th night, the tension inside the tower had become impossible to ignore. That was the night both of them heard it. Footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate, coming from the spiral staircase above them. At first, Nate assumed Russell had gone upstairs again, maybe checking the beacon. But when he looked across the room, Russell was already standing near the base of the stairs, frozen, his eyes locked upward. Nate asked him quietly if he'd just come down from the lantern room. Russell shook his head. Then Russell asked Nate the same question. Neither of them had moved, and yet the sound continued. One step, then another, slowly descending the metal staircase from the beacon room above. Both men stood there without speaking, listening to the steady rhythm of someone or something moving down the tower. And then, it stopped, just like that. No final step, no door opening, nothing, only silence. The kind of silence that makes a place feel suddenly much smaller. That night, they didn't take any chances. They dragged a heavy dresser across the bedroom doorway, wedging it tight against the frame. And before turning off the lights, they kept a small utility tool within reach. By the 11th night, whatever was happening inside that lighthouse had stopped feeling like a series of strange incidents. It felt personal. Nate woke up suddenly again in the middle of the night, the same uneasy jolt pulling him out of sleep. Before he even opened his eyes, he already knew something was wrong. The tower had gone dark. The beacon had stopped. He didn't bother asking questions this time. He and Russell were out of their beds within seconds, moving quickly toward the spiral staircase. The metal steps rang under their boots as they climbed toward the lantern room. But halfway up, Nate noticed something that made his stomach drop. The door to the beacon room was already open. Not unlocked, not slightly ajar. Wide open, swinging back and forth slowly as the wind pushed through the tower, like someone had thrown it open in a hurry and never bothered to close it again. When they stepped inside, the scene waiting for them made the situation even worse. The beacon wasn't just stuck this time. Someone or something had clearly interfered with it. The massive bulb that powered the light had been completely removed from its housing and set upright in the center of the floor. Those bulbs are heavy, thick glass, built to withstand harsh weather and years of operation. Removing one takes real effort. It's not something that happens accidentally. Nate stood there, staring at it, his mind racing, trying to understand how it could have happened. Behind him, Russell had started whispering again. Not to Nate, to himself. Over and over, he kept repeating that someone had done it, that someone was inside the tower with them. Then Nate felt it. Then Nate felt something brush his back, cold and quick, like a sudden draft in a sealed room. He spun around immediately, expecting to see Russell standing behind him. But there was no one there. Russell, meanwhile, had gone completely pale. His eyes were fixed on the stone wall beside the beacon mechanism. He raised a shaking hand and pointed toward the bricks. His voice dropped as he said he thought he saw something move along the wall, just for a second. That was enough. Neither of them stayed another second. They rushed back down the spiral staircase, slammed the bedroom door shut, and locked themselves inside the small room at the base of the tower. Nate didn't sleep at all for the rest of the night. Russell sat in the corner for hours, rocking slowly back and forth, whispering to someone Nate couldn't see. As soon as the first hint of daylight crept through the windows, Nate grabbed the emergency satellite phone and called for immediate pickup. He kept the explanation simple. He reported a serious mechanical issue with the beacon and requested extraction as soon as possible. The response boat arrived later that afternoon. And that's when the strangest part of the entire story surfaced. As soon as Nate stepped aboard, one of the crew members asked him about the distress call they had received earlier that morning. Specifically, the one that came in at 2:12 a.m. Nate just stared at him, because he hadn't made any call during the night. In fact, the satellite phone hadn't been touched until after sunrise. The deckhand explained that the signal they received had been weak and full of static. The voice on the line was hard to understand, but they were sure it came from the lighthouse. The message was broken up, just fragments that made it sound like they weren't alone. Then the transmission cut off. Russell didn't say a single word during the entire boat ride back to the mainland. A few months later, he quietly left the Coast Guard. He never explained what he thought had happened on that island. As for Nate, he still works maintenance assignments from time to time, but there is one place he refuses to return to: Martinicus Rock. This next story happened during the stretch of the COVID lockdowns, when everyone was starting to feel trapped inside their own lives. Days blurred together, weekends didn't feel any different from weekdays, and most nights were spent scrolling through your phone just to pass time. Back then I was single, stuck at home like everyone else, flipping through movies while swiping on Tinder and messaging people just to have someone to talk to. One night I ended up starting a conversation with a girl I had actually followed on Instagram for years. Her name was Sophia, though everyone called her Soph. We both lived out in Suffolk County on Long Island, close enough that meeting up wasn't a big deal. The Hamptons were about half an hour away from us, and Montauk sat further east along the coast. After a few messages back and forth, we realized we were both equally bored, so we made a quick plan to hang out that same night. She only lived about 5 minutes from me, so I picked her up and we drove over to a nearby park that had technically been closed for weeks because of the lockdown rules. The place was empty though. No cars, no patrols, nothing but quiet trees and dark pathways. We sat there in the car, talked for a while, and watched the empty park. Right away I could tell Soph had a certain energy about her. Not reckless exactly, but definitely the type of person who didn't mind bending a few rules if it meant having a good story later. She joked about hopping fences, sneaking into places after hours, doing things that most people would probably think twice about. And honestly, I didn't mind that at all. Within maybe 40 minutes of talking, she suddenly looked over at me with this grin and said we should drive out to Montauk and walk the cliffs by the lighthouse. Technically, the lighthouse grounds close after sunset, and during lockdown there was a good chance the area was fully shut down anyway. Neither of us knew for sure, but the idea sounded like the kind of random adventure that made the night feel less ordinary. So we finished our drinks, got back on the road, and drove all the way east toward Montauk Point. By the time we got there, the area was completely empty. The lighthouse tower stood tall above the shoreline, its rotating beam cutting across the dark ocean in slow, steady arcs. Soph told me to just pull into the main parking lot like it was nothing. I hesitated for a second. Parking in a closed lot at night didn't exactly feel like a great idea, but the place looked deserted, not a single other car anywhere in sight. Soph just laughed and said she'd done this before, even before the lockdown started. According to her, security almost never came out there during the off-season, so I trusted her. We sat in the car for a little longer, finishing another drink, and every few minutes I caught myself glancing around the lot to make sure headlights weren't suddenly pulling in behind us. Soph noticed and kept telling me to relax. Eventually we got out and started walking toward the lighthouse. Seeing it up close at night was strange in a way I hadn't expected. During the day, it's just a landmark, something tourists take photos of. But standing there in the dark, with the beam rotating overhead, it felt different. The light would sweep across the ground every few seconds, briefly illuminating the rocks and grass before fading again. For a moment, you'd see everything clearly. Then it would vanish back into shadow. Soph led the way around the backside of the lighthouse, away from the main entrance. From there, a rough path of rocks stretched along the cliff edge, a narrow trail locals called the Cliff Walk. It was my first time ever being there, and down along that path, there were almost no lights at all. Just the faint glow from the lighthouse behind us, and the 2 small flashlights we carried as we stepped carefully out onto the rocks, following the dark line of the coastline. We had only been walking along the cliff path for a few minutes when Soph suddenly called my name from behind me. Not loudly, just enough to make me stop. There was something in her voice that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up immediately. When I turned around, she was standing still on the rocks, her flashlight raised over her shoulder. The beam of light pointed past her, toward the darkness behind us. "Someone's back there," she said quietly. I lifted my own flashlight and aimed it the same direction. That's when we saw him, a figure standing several yards behind us on the rocks. He hadn't made a sound, no footsteps, no shifting stones. He was just there. The hood of a thick coat covered most of his head, shadowing his face so we couldn't see much detail. The light hit him just long enough to make out the outline of a person watching us. Not walking, not approaching, just standing there. For a moment, no one spoke. I assumed maybe he worked there, some kind of staff member who'd noticed us out after hours. So I called out to him, asking if he worked at the lighthouse. The man didn't answer. He didn't move either. That silence made the situation feel even stranger. So I tried to end it quickly. I told him we were leaving and apologized if we weren't supposed to be down there. That's when he finally spoke. His voice carried across the rocks in a casual tone that didn't match the situation at all. He asked if we wanted to buy something. For a split second, I almost wished he had been security, because realizing this was just some random guy wandering the cliffs at night didn't make things better. If anything, it made it worse. I shook my head and told him we were good. Then I motioned for Soph to keep moving. I let her walk ahead of me while I stayed slightly behind, glancing back every few seconds with the flashlight. At first, the man remained where he was, but then he started walking too, not rushing, not calling out again, just following. And the strangest part was the way he matched our pace perfectly. Every time I looked back, he stayed at almost the exact same distance behind us, close enough to see in the beam of light, far enough that he never fully entered it. It made the entire walk feel tense. Every step along the rocks felt slower. The sound of the ocean crashing below us seemed louder. The beam from the lighthouse kept sweeping over the cliff, briefly lighting the area before plunging everything back into darkness again. Eventually we reached the end of the cliff walk and stepped onto the grassy area that led back toward the parking lot. I looked behind us again. He was still there, still walking, still keeping the same distance. Then we heard him call out again from the darkness. It sounded like he asked where we were going. At that point, I knew responding would only make things worse. I told Soph quietly not to answer, and we kept walking faster toward the car. That's when things got even more uncomfortable. Two more figures appeared near the edge of the parking lot. They had been coming from a different direction entirely. 3 people now, all moving toward us. Running would have made it obvious we were scared, and that probably would have triggered a chase. So we kept our pace steady, trying to act like nothing was wrong as we headed straight for the car. The moment we reached it, we both hurried inside. And that's when everything happened at once. Before I even finished locking the doors, all 3 of them were suddenly right next to the car. Soph and I both shouted in surprise. 2 of them tried the door handles right away, but the locks held. Without thinking, I slammed the car into reverse. It was the only direction I could move without putting the car any nearer to them. As the car rolled backward, they banged on the car and shouted, but I couldn't make out the words through the glass. But once the car picked up speed and the distance opened between us, they stopped. They didn't chase us. They just stood there near the lot as we drove away. The entire ride back was quiet, like we were both afraid to say out loud what almost happened. Both of our hearts were still pounding from the adrenaline, and once the initial rush faded, neither of us had much to say. I dropped Soph off at her place, and we called it a night. We actually hung out plenty of times after that, and we still keep in touch today. But that night at Montauk, it stuck with me. Because when I think back on it now, it feels like we were only a few seconds away from that situation turning into something much worse. Some of my friends later guessed it might have been a local gang hanging around the area. Maybe they were right. Whatever the truth was, though, one thing is certain. After that night, I had no interest in going back there after dark. Quick question, what would you have done in that situation? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I read them all. And if you want more unsettling nighttime stories like this, you can subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Once I dropped Soph off, I tried to forget the whole night, but it reminded me of another story I was told, one that still makes my skin crawl, my friend Ian's. It belongs to an old friend of mine named Ian. For years, he mentioned it only in passing little fragments, here and there during long conversations. But every time it came up, the tone of his voice changed. Not dramatic, just quieter. Like he was remembering something he never fully figured out. Eventually, I asked him to write the whole thing down, the full account, every detail he could remember. He did, and after reading it, I understood why that place never left his mind. Ian was the kind of man you trusted the moment you met him. Mid-50s, broad shoulders, skin permanently rough from years of wind and salt. The kind of guy who had spent most of his life working near the water, not in an office, out in the elements. His work revolved around marine salvage and coastal infrastructure. If a dock collapsed, a buoy system failed, or some forgotten structure offshore needed to be inspected, Ian was often the person people called. And he didn't just show up with a toolbox. Over the years, he had done a little bit of everything: commercial diving, ship maintenance, structural inspections. At one point, he even worked on remote survey contracts tied to government projects. By the time I met him, he had already seen more strange situations on the water than most people experience in a lifetime, which is exactly why I never doubted his story. Ian said it began when a small county in Washington state hired him to inspect a lighthouse that had been abandoned for decades. The property had become a problem. Developers wanted the structure removed so the land could be redeveloped. Local historians argued it should be preserved as a landmark. Meanwhile, the county didn't want to spend the money on either option. So they hired Ian to answer a simple question. Was the lighthouse even safe to restore, or was it too damaged to save? The assignment itself sounded straightforward enough. Travel out to the island, inspect the structure from top to bottom, document the condition of the building, and file a report. The only unusual part was the location. The lighthouse stood alone on a small rock island about an hour off the mainland. Not much more than a lump of stone rising out of the water, maybe 300 feet across at its widest point. There was nothing out there except the tower itself, a small generator shed, and the rusting remains of scaffolding left behind from repairs decades earlier. No visitors, no residents, no regular boat traffic. The island didn't even have a proper dock, just a narrow ledge of rock where a small Coast Guard boat could drop someone off during high tide. Ian didn't mind that part. Working alone in remote places was nothing new to him. He packed only the essentials: food for a few days, a sleeping bag, basic inspection tools, a clipboard for notes, and a marine radio for communication. The plan was simple. A boat would drop him off Monday morning. He'd spend a couple days inspecting the structure, and by Thursday afternoon, they'd come back to pick him up. At least, that was the plan before he actually spent a night inside that lighthouse. Ian had worked alone in remote places many times before, so being dropped off on that island didn't bother him at all. To him, it was just another inspection job. When the boat pulled away and the sound of its engine faded into the distance, the island fell into a deep, heavy quiet. The sky was gray, and the air carried that familiar scent of salt, rust, and old metal that clings to abandoned coastal structures. The lighthouse itself stood about 50 feet tall, a narrow tower built sometime in the early 1900s. Inside was the typical spiral staircase that wound its way up to the lantern room. The original beacon hadn't been operational for years, but the building itself was still standing strong. Ian started the job the way he always did, slow and methodical. He checked the structural supports, tested the stairs for stability, inspected the windows and the outer frame. The ground floor had warped wooden boards, but they were still safe enough to walk on. The second level looked like an old storage area with rusted cabinets and nothing else. The third level held a small sleeping space that clearly hadn't been used in decades. Instead of setting up there, Ian rolled out his sleeping bag on the ground floor near the generator room, where it was warmer and better protected from the wind. That first night passed quietly. Almost too quietly. Later, Ian told me something about that silence stuck with him. Normally, when you're near the ocean, you hear something: birds, waves, hitting rock, insects, anything. But that night, there was almost nothing, just faint wind brushing against the tower. The next morning, a thick fog rolled in from the water. When Ian stepped to the window, the entire island had vanished into white. Visibility was barely a few feet in any direction. The fog wasn't unusual for that region, but he said this one felt different, so dense it looked like a solid wall pressing against the glass. Still, work was work. He spent most of that second day inspecting the upper stairwell and documenting structural details. That's when he noticed the first thing that didn't sit right. Halfway up the staircase, there was a small maintenance closet built into the wall. The first time he tried opening it the day before, the hinges were so rusted it wouldn't move at all. Now, the door was slightly open, not wide, just enough to show a thin line of darkness inside. At first, Ian assumed the humidity from the fog had shifted the frame. That can happen with old wood and metal. But when he pushed the door open further, he saw something sitting in the back corner. A small wooden box, about the size of a lunch container. Its surface was damp and coated with something green and mossy, almost like it had spent time submerged in water. Ian didn't touch it. He simply closed the closet again and wrote it down in his notes. But that night, something woke him up. Not a sound exactly, more like the sudden absence of sound. It felt like the entire tower had gone still. Then he heard it. Footsteps, metal steps, echoing somewhere above him in the spiral staircase. At first, Ian assumed some kind of animal had gotten inside the tower, maybe a raccoon or seabird. But then he realized something strange. The footsteps weren't coming down. They were moving upward. Slow, steady, climbing toward the top of the lighthouse. Ian grabbed his flashlight and aimed it toward the base of the stairwell, waiting for whatever it was to appear. Nothing did. Eventually, the steps stopped, and the silence returned. The following morning, he searched the entire tower, every floor, every room, every hatch and corner he could access. Nothing. No animals. No signs anyone had entered the building, except for one detail: the wooden box. It was no longer inside the closet. Now it sat halfway out in the stairwell, just resting there on the metal steps. Still damp, still covered in that same mossy growth. Ian told me he stared at it for a long time before deciding what to do. Eventually he picked it up. The wood felt swollen from moisture, and the weight surprised him. It was heavier than something that small should have been. When he tried lifting the lid, it didn't budge. The top had been nailed shut. Rather than forcing it open, Ian carried the box down to the bottom of the stairs and left it there. Something about it made him uneasy, so he stepped outside to clear his head. That's when he noticed something else. Footprints in the dirt around the lighthouse. But they weren't boot prints. They were bare, wet footprints. Human footprints. They began near the north side of the building and continued in a straight line across the ground toward the cliff edge. Ian followed them carefully. There were maybe 10, maybe 12 impressions in total, and then they stopped, right at the edge of the cliff. There were no prints leading back, just the drop into the ocean below. Ian stood there for several minutes, trying to explain it logically. Maybe someone had come ashore by boat earlier and climbed up from the rocks. Maybe he had simply missed them somehow. But according to the schedule, the only boat due to arrive was the one picking him up the next day. The fog was still thick enough that calling for an early pickup didn't make much sense either. A boat might not even be able to find the island in those conditions. So Ian returned inside and took precautions. He locked every door and hatch he could find. Then, he wedged a heavy iron pipe across the base of the stairwell so nothing could come down from above without moving it. That night was worse. Around the middle of the night, he heard a violent bang from the upper level. The door to the lantern room had slammed shut so hard the entire tower shook. Dust drifted down from the ceiling. Then came the knocking. 3 slow taps. Not on the door, not on a window. Inside the wall, like something tapping from inside the wall, close enough to feel, impossible to explain. Ian didn't move. He stayed perfectly still in his sleeping bag until the sound finally stopped. When daylight arrived, he went to check the stairwell again. The iron pipe was still where he had placed it, but the wooden box was gone, and the maintenance closet upstairs now stood fully open. At that point, Ian stopped trying to explain anything. He grabbed the marine radio and requested immediate extraction. To avoid questions, he simply reported a medical concern and asked for a boat as soon as possible. They told him they would try to reach him within a few hours. So he packed his gear and waited near the rocky ledge where boats could approach the island. The fog never lifted. If anything, it became thicker. For nearly 7 hours he sat there, able to see no more than a few feet in any direction. Late in the afternoon, as the air grew colder and the sun began dropping somewhere behind the fog, Ian heard something behind him. Footsteps in the gravel near the base of the lighthouse. He turned immediately, but there was no one there, or at least, no one he could see through the dense fog. At that point, he moved closer to the cliff edge and stayed there until he finally heard the distant horn of the approaching boat. They pulled him off the island just after dark. One of the crew members looked at him and joked that he looked like he'd seen a ghost. Ian didn't laugh. He simply told them the lighthouse wasn't safe and recommended the site be sealed off. Later, when he submitted his official report, he wrote that the structure was compromised and unsuitable for restoration. He never mentioned the footsteps, and he never mentioned the box. When Ian sent me the written account, that was where his story ended. He never added dramatic conclusions. No theories about what might have been on that island. No claims about anything supernatural. In fact, the reason he never included those details in his official report was because he wasn't even sure he trusted his own memory of it. Spending days alone in a silent place like that can play tricks on anyone's mind, and he admitted that possibility more than once. But there were a few things he couldn't ignore. For one, he never went back. Not to that lighthouse, and not to any job like it again. Over the next several months, Ian slowly finished the few remaining contracts he had lined up. After that, he began turning down new work. At first, he told people he was just taking a break from field assignments. Then the break quietly became permanent. Within a year, he had stepped away from the industry entirely. For a man who had spent most of his life working offshore, inspecting wrecks, diving beneath ships, and repairing structures in the harshest conditions along the coast, that was a big change. When people asked why, he usually gave a simple answer. He said he wanted to stick to calmer work from then on. One evening, I finally asked him directly if that abandoned lighthouse had something to do with it. He didn't deny it, but he didn't explain either. He just gave a small shrug and said he had seen enough strange things out there over the years. I pushed him once more, only once, asking what he truly believed had happened during those nights on that island. Ian looked at me for a long moment before answering. Then he said something that stayed with me long after that conversation ended. He said there are places in the world that are better left alone. Places that seem to settle into their own silence if no one disturbs them. And sometimes the smartest thing a person can do is walk away and let them stay that way. After that, he wouldn't talk about it again. Curiosity got the better of me a while later, so I tried to dig into the location myself. Ian had scribbled down rough coordinates in his notes, and I figured finding information about the lighthouse wouldn't be difficult. But the search turned out stranger than I expected. The coordinates didn't match any listed lighthouse in that area. County records did mention an old decommissioned tower somewhere off the coast, but the references were vague. No official name, no clear documentation, no photographs, and no detailed history. It was as if the structure barely existed in the records at all. And that's the part that unsettles me the most. Not what Ian claimed happened during those nights, but the fact that almost no one else seems to acknowledge that place ever existed in the first place. To this day, I still don't know what explanation I would prefer. Whether Ian experienced something he simply couldn't explain, or whether isolation and silence on that island slowly began playing tricks on his mind. Honestly, I'm not sure which possibility is more disturbing. If this story stuck with you, share your own experience, or a story someone you trust has told you in the comments. And if you'd like more eerie coastal and lighthouse tales, hit like and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories coming.